7 years to find out whether they understand the information surrounding the drug, that they understand how to take it, and more importantly, that they understand what to do if something goes wrong or it doesn't happen or an unexpected or untoward event occurs, what they do in response to that. So let me finish. We know here in the hospital that we need to pay attention to how well patients take their drugs, and that opens a whole Pandora's box about what we need to do with patients once they leave the hospital and take medications home with them. And that is going to be the next area of our clinical focus. We are experimenting now with direct patient education and interactions. We're taking time out of the day to talk to patients, to find out what the barriers are to adherence and what can be removed, and certainly look at the tools that can improve patient medication as we move forward. So with that, I have on my clock 9:21, and I was supposed to finish at 9:20. So we have, how about that, huh? I'm 1 minute over. I'm 1 minute over. So I've provided you with a lot of information. We have about 5 or 6 minutes right now, and I'll open it up for any questions. Portraits, I think I can answer most of your questions. Pictures, etc. Fire away.
I understand that the heparin was contaminated in 2008, but when did the actual warning go out?
So the question is when did the warning go out for heparin? I want to say it was January of 2009. Okay, so I believe the first alert. So how this played out is the MedWatch program. The reports came in 2008. In late 2008, in December, the FDA recognized there was a cluster of deaths in a Missouri children's hospital. They went to investigate. They traced the drug, heparin, back to a facility in New Jersey. And they made the facility withdraw their heparin from the market in January of 2009. And within 3 or 4 weeks, they realized that the problem was much, much bigger than that. And that not only was it that one batch of heparin, it turns out there were problems with all kinds of batches of heparin, and not only from that one company, but from multiple companies. And not only did they pull all of the heparin from that company, they pulled all devices. So we have heparin-coated catheters, collection tubes, etc. So it was about in March that they realized there was a major problem. It took about 6 months later before them to identify the contaminant. And then by the fall, the FDA had put in measures to assess the raw materials that were coming into the United States for the presence of that contaminant. The contaminant was something called over-sulfated chondroitin. So basically, heparin comes from pig intestine. If you take other parts of the animal and throw it into your batch of preparation, you get a bigger batch and you can sell it for more. I think we have eliminated many of the problems, but it magnifies or suggests to you that we could do better with newer agents, I think, that Dr. Goldhaber is going to talk about than the agents like heparin or even warfarin. Does that answer your question? Heparin is nothing more than a sugar molecule. So if you take simple table sugar, okay, heparin is nothing more than small sugar molecules that are linked together in a big, long chain. And for whatever reason, there was a young man at Johns Hopkins in the 1800s that was looking for materials that would cause the blood to clot. And he took this material and found it prevented the blood from clotting in the 1800s, and we are still using that agent today. So it is nothing more than a sugar molecule. Warfarin is different. We'll talk, and I know Dave's going to talk a little bit about warfarin later on, because that we can make in is a relatively small molecule. We still get the chemical from China. We still have sources of pig from Europe. But the standards across the world changed essentially overnight in terms of providing safety. Now, could the event happen again with some other drug or some other agent? Sure, because people are very, very ingenious. Question in the back. If you look at a vial of heparin, I think 70% of the sugar chains that are put together have no pharmacologic or anticoagulant effect. Imagine that. So this is, you're not that. That's why I say when you look at the pictures of people in the wall that have been, studying medicine for centuries, our improvements are marginal. We make small steps. So to use an agent like heparin, it's still we've made improvements on it. There are some other agents that we use, but this is what we have to work with, and it works. Other questions? Oh, sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain exactly what that means? I can't even pronounce it.
Sure. Sure, and I'll leave. So the question is what is HIT? HIT is heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. So it is essentially an allergy to heparin. So when you give patients heparin, for some, their immune system sees the molecule as being different and attaches, your immune system attaches antibodies to it. And in that step process, it creates an immunologic reaction so that any heparin that you give actually causes a destructive process of your platelets that are responsible for blood clotting. And it's a dangerous situation to have. It's typically transient. So after the exposure, within a few months, the problem typically goes away. But for us in the hospital, it represents a major problem. Is there a solution? Yes, there is. And part of it is the early recognition. And so we follow patients in their terms of their blood counts and their platelets. But more importantly, there are other drugs that are non-heparin based that you can give patients, and Dr. Goldhaber is going to talk about one of them. So all is not lost. Other questions? Have I ever been to China to see their labs? I wish I had. I've been to multiple locations. I can tell you as a pharmacist, I have visited numerous drug companies around the United States and in Europe. And for the vast majority of companies, if you go across the river and go visit Genzyme or Biogen, you would be amazed at the technology that they have. So I think what you're looking at with heparin is an old drug with old manufacturing processes and basically, I would. Have you been there? Okay, so there you go, and that doesn't surprise me. Okay, and I think that's what the FDA did, at least to several. Yeah, they did. Other questions? Well, I will stop here, and I'll introduce Dr. Goldhaber. So, for frame of reference, I assume many of you probably have seen Dr. Goldhaber in one form, facet, or another. And he runs not only our anticoagulation clinic here, so he's responsible for directing that. No worries, take your time.
So you're good to go.
He's also a cardiologist by trade. I expect that you will someday see his portrait on the wall here. All the better than the one that I have. So can we welcome him to the...
I want to thank John for being such a good moderator and host. And I guess I'll tell you about I wasn't planning to do this, but I'll tell you about a few of those whose portraits are on the wall who are of particular importance to me in my career. Probably Dr. Brownwall, right here in the front. He mentored me since I was a first-year medical student at Harvard Medical School. We had little sections where we would look at heart tissue under a microscope. And he was already extraordinarily famous by then, and Brigham and Women's, which was not very well known, had recruited him from San Diego. And he and this other very famous cardiologist, Dr. Sonnenbluck, were going around the room. There were probably 16 of us, each with our own microscope, and they were making sure we could really see the actin and the myosin. He has become a great mentor and friend, and he was the one who gave me the opportunity to use the clotbuster TPA in pulmonary embolism. And of course, a few of you in the room, I've had the opportunity to administer TPA to you, and it subsequently became FDA approved. But he was the one who gave me that special opportunity. Dr. Tom Smith, whose portrait's probably the lowest one, well, this young-looking guy there, he was the chief of cardiology at the Brigham for about 20-plus years. I remember when I was a first-year medical student, he came and gave us a lecture, and he had a patient with angina. He died at age 60 from mesothelioma. And now, for the past 10 years, I've been running a course where we always have on the first day a Thomas W. Smith Memorial Lecture, and it gives me an opportunity to reconnect with the Smith family. But he's definitely a very important figure in my life. And because we're limited for time, one other individual, this distinguished-looking man with the bow tie, Leroy Van Dam, chief of anesthesiology at the Brigham. He taught me how to intubate patients, how to put a breathing tube into patients as they were being given anesthesia. And in med school, my most exciting course or rotation was when I was sent to Colombia in South America for 2 months. Now, I got a month of intensive training in Spanish the month before I went there. I'd had 6 years of Latin, 6 years of French, AP Latin and French, but no Spanish. And probably that month of Spanish in med school has served me well ever since, because we are very much in a Spanish-speaking community, and so I get to use Spanish every day. But I had a little trepidation because I knew I would be doing the anesthesia in the operating room. That's what the fourth-year med students did. And Dr. Van Dam took me under his wing, gave me a little extra instruction. I went to the Harvard Coop to purchase his textbook, and they were sold out, and I was leaving the next day, so he just gave me one and autographed it. And he had various hobbies, including watercolors, and when I was getting married, he gave me a watercolor, which we have hanging as a wedding present. So this room is very special, and I think that it just speaks to Brigham and Women's as a very special institution. Now, today is really a very important day because it's more than just being here to learn more about anticoagulation. This marks a turning point in the anticoagulation management service. I see Julie just outside the room. I want you to come in because I don't know if all of you know Julie Atai. She's the manager of the anticoagulation service. She's uniquely qualified because not only does she have a PharmD, but she has an MBA. And this really has become it requires a lot of business administration to do a good job. Julie has put this whole program together. So let's give her a round of applause. Julie has also instituted a lot of changes in the way we do business on the service, so that each of the pharmacists has a panel of several hundred patients, so you don't get a random pharmacist anymore when you're calling up and interacting. And she's made many other improvements behind the scenes that are really too numerous to count. So thank you, Julie, for all the hard work you did. to gather us together and organize this morning's program. So we've made a conscious decision that we're here to empower you by knowledge. Knowledge is power. And this is not just a one-shot deal. We have a series of educational programs. Now I want you to take notes because I'm going to give you some dates, for other programs that I would like you to sign up for. You can do a flash-in-the-pan, wonderful program, but we want this to be a continuous, ongoing, interactive experience. So I'm going to tell you about 4 additional programs all this calendar year, and I'm going to tell you what they're about, and I'd like you to attend 2 of the 4, let's say. I'll be at all 4 of them. The next program, we're all involved with the NATF, the North American Thrombosis Forum. That's our nonprofit organization. We're just entering our 5th year as a nonprofit organization. And 3 of the 4 programs I'm going to tell you about are sponsored by NATF. John, being modest as he is, didn't tell you he's one of the 4 founding directors. And John also has an MBA. He's the treasurer of NATF. I'm the president of NATF. And we have a program Thursday, April 28th, from 4 p.m. to 9 p.m., across the street at Harvard Medical School on atrial fibrillation. And I know about half of you have atrial fibrillation here, or are here to support someone who has atrial fibrillation. Okay, so that's Thursday, April 28th, from 4 to 9 p.m. And actually, the details of this during the 30-minute break, you can go to the NATF desk and actually sign up and register, and then it's a done deal. Friday morning, April 29, we have a program on DVT. And I know, because I've looked at the pre-registration statistics, that about half of you have DVT or pulmonary embolism or are here with someone who has DVT or pulmonary embolism. And we have a program on Friday morning where we're bringing, it's not only us, but I'm bringing in speakers who are known from around the world to supplement what we do and to teach all of us a little more about DVT and pulmonary embolism.
What time is that?
Breakfast at 7:30 on Friday morning, and the program goes to about noon, and then we serve lunch. Friday, April 29. It's across the street. The room numbers and everything are at the NATF desk. Okay, the NATF website is natfonline.org. So far, let me repeat the 2 dates. The first, atrial fibrillation, 4 to 9 p.m. on Thursday, April 28. DVT and pulmonary embolism. It's really, the program will get underway around 8 a.m. 8 a.m. until noon, followed by lunch on Friday, April 29. And then the next, okay, so that's the DVT pulmonary embolism one. The next program is really geared for those of you who are nurses, physicians, or pharmacists, because it's a 5-day program. It's not geared toward non-medical people. It's a once every 2 year 5-day cardiovascular review of all aspects of cardiology and cardiovascular medicine. And that starts Sunday, May 1, and goes through Thursday, May 5. On Sunday, May 1, we have the Thomas W. Smith Memorial Lecture. And then some of you must have heard about our very dear friend Kenneth Boffman, who was a wonderful cardiologist, a physical fitness guru also, who was struck by a car and killed a little over a year ago when he was jogging at 6 a.m. at the American Heart Association meeting in Orlando. We have the first ever Kenneth L. Boffman Memorial Lecture. He died also at age 60 on Wednesday, May 4. So that's a 5-day program, May 1 through May 5. That's for the minority of you who are here. Then the other huge program is the Thrombosis Summit that we have once a year in September. This year, it's an all-day event. This year, it's Saturday, September 24. It will start around 8 a.m. That will include breakfast and lunch also. Just all the programs I mentioned have breakfast and lunch. And that will be at the Fairmont Copley Plaza Hotel. I also want to acknowledge and hope he'll stand up my mentor, who more than anyone else got me interested and intrigued by pulmonary embolism, and also one of the founding directors of the North American Thrombosis Forum, Dr. Arthur Sasahara. Art, do you want to stand up? I was Dr. Sasahara's chief medical resident when he, for many years, was chair of the Department of Medicine at the West Roxbury VA Hospital. And Dr. Sasahara is a founding member on the board of directors of NATF. And he's also an active member of our venous thromboembolism research group. So those are the 4 additional education programs. In other words, the idea here, this is an ongoing learning and interactive. And for those of you who want to be more involved in what we're doing, NATF has a wonderful advocacy committee. We really welcome your involvement, tackling things like public policy and other advocacy issues. And again, you can go to the desk during the break. All right, any questions about these introductory remarks before I get down to the subject of the novel oral anticoagulants? No, I'm not going to mail them to you. We're doing less and less mail for a lot of reasons. Everything I said to you is on the NATF website. So the website, NATF Online, all one word, .org. There are, however, we do have pamphlets at the NATF desk for the April 28 and April 29 programs. I'm going to talk about problems with warfarin. Many of you are familiar with those firsthand, and then tell you about some of the exciting new developments. The area that I'm in medicine, as a cardiologist and blood clot expert, has had its ups and downs in terms of how interested the rest of the world is in what we do. And right now, this area is very hot. It's on fire. Things have never been as exciting as they are now in terms of drug development. Warfarin, as many of you know firsthand, has a delayed onset and offset. It can have an unpredictable dose response. There's a narrow therapeutic index. There are hundreds of drug-drug and drug-food interactions. Monitoring with the INRs is problematic. Despite good monitoring, the bleeding rate can still be high. And if you want to get rid of the warfarin, reversibility is slow. This is a study of stroke prevention and atrial fibrillation, where the idea was to compare warfarin with clopidogrel, an antiplatelet agent, plus aspirin. And what we do when we're trying to figure out whether the warfarin control is good, we have a metric we use called the TTR, time in the therapeutic range. The higher the TTR, the better the control of the warfarin. When the TTR is less than 65%, at those centers, oral anticoagulation with warfarin was not any better at preventing strokes from atrial fibrillation than clopidogrel plus aspirin. However, when the TTR was greater than 65%, when patients were in their therapeutic INR range, usually 2.0 to 3.0, and when that was greater than 65%, oral anticoagulated patients with warfarin had a much lower stroke rate than those who were on clopidogrel plus aspirin. So how do we get patients into a TTR as quickly as possible? It turns out that there are now several genetic tests that can be done, and they can be done within several hours to help predict what the right dose of warfarin is, rather than spending the first month guessing around, making an educated guess of what the dose should be. And one of the tests involves 2C9 genotyping, and the other involves vitamin K receptor polymorphism testing. And whether we should be doing these tests routinely remains a matter of debate. We're not entirely sure yet. But there was a study published last year where a group of patients who were starting warfarin for the first time did get these rapid turnaround genetic tests. They're in this intervention group, or IG, shown here. And they were compared with a historical control group, HC, shown up here. The historical control group didn't have the special genetic testing. The interventional group did, to figure out what the precise initial dose of warfarin should be. And what was found was that the likelihood of hospitalization during the next 180 days for any cause was much lower in the group that got the intervention with rapid turnaround genetic testing. And hospitalization specifically for bleeding or thromboembolism problems were much lower with the intervention group than with the historical control group. There are 2 NIH-sponsored trials underway to help us figure out whether we should be using this rapid turnaround genetic testing routinely. And the results will be available in 2014. I'll keep you posted. I'm on the steering committee for one of them called the COAG study. Both studies are still open, but they're for patients who've not yet started warfarin, who are about to start warfarin. And they're multi-centered studies, so there are centers throughout the country for each of these 2 trials. Now, I'm going to talk about the whole class of the novel oral anticoagulants. They have certain advantages and disadvantages. Here are the advantages. Within an hour or 2 of taking the pill of these novel oral anticoagulants, they work. You're completely anticoagulated. Whereas, with warfarin, it can be 5, 7, 10 days before it's fully effective. They are given in a fixed dose. No dose modification whatsoever. And there's no laboratory coagulation monitoring. No INRs, no other blood testing is needed specifically for figuring out what dose to be on. Unlike warfarin, there are minimal drug-drug or drug-food interactions. You can eat as much spinach, broccoli, Brussels sprouts as you want. No restrictions. They are being developed for broad indications: DVT, pulmonary embolism, stroke prevention and atrial fibrillation, and for acute coronary syndrome. Now, here's another advantage. They have a short half-life. Those of you who've been on Warfarin, who've needed colonoscopies, for example, you know we have to go through this huge procedure. What should we do? And we have this 4 or 5 day process while the warfarin wears off. The process of preparing for a colonoscopy or elective surgery with these new drugs is you don't take the drug the night before or the morning of surgery. That's it. There are dozens of novel oral anticoagulants under development. I'm going to mention 4. I think that's enough for one Saturday morning. I'm not going to spend an equal amount of time on them. I'm going to spend most of the time on Dabigatran, which is the first one, because that's the only one of the 4 that's FDA approved. I list the other 3 novel oral anticoagulants in the order that I predict they will obtain FDA approval, but I will tell you I don't have any special secret line to the FDA to know what's going to happen. But my educated guess is that the other 3 will eventually be approved, and the other 3 are called rivaroxaban, apixaban, and edoxaban. So I'll spend less and less time. Like when we get to edoxaban, if we get to it, I'll only have one slide, and and if it's time to break for the exhibits, and so you can go to the NATF desk and sign up for the programs. We're going to break right on time. I won't even get to edoxaban. The only one I really want to talk about this morning is Dabigatran, because that's out there, and you need to know about it. And that was also a good idea for a time check. We will break for sure no later than 10:30. We won't go a minute over. We might even stop before, because I want you all to be able to line up at that NATF desk. October 19, 2010 was a historic day if you're a blood clot expert, because 1954 is when warfarin was allowed onto the market. And from 1954 until October 19, 2010, there was no other oral anticoagulant allowed for use in the United States. And then the FDA approved Dabigatran. They approved it for stroke prevention for those of you who have atrial fibrillation in a dose of 150 milligrams twice a day. And the reason it was approved is that there was a pivotal clinical trial called RELY. We're going to talk about the RELY trial, showing that Dabigatran reduced the stroke rate 34% lower than warfarin in a head-to-head comparison. The main dose is 150 milligrams twice a day. For patients with severe kidney problems, there's a lower dose of 75 milligrams twice a day. But that dose is not really important for us. I've only prescribed it to one patient so far. If you have complete kidney failure and you're on dialysis, Dabigatran is not FDA approved. It's for that step just before permanent hemodialysis. This is the RELY trial. And I think you should know about it. It's a very ambitious trial. Big trials these days are done all over. They're done in centers all over the world. Some of the patients are from the United States, but they're from Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America. And the studies are very expensive to undertake. Many tens of millions of dollars to carry out a trial like this. And then, of course, that's the reason why the drugs go on patent and become expensive, because to bring a drug to market, nowadays costs more than $1 billion to get a drug successfully to market. And this study had about 18,000 patients in it with atrial fibrillation. And it's a randomized trial. 6,000 or so patients received the usual warfarin with the target INR between 2 and 3. 6,000 or so received a lower dose of Dabigatran, 110 milligrams twice a day. That dose didn't make it to market in the United States. The FDA did not approve it because it wasn't any better than warfarin. It tied warfarin. It wasn't any better. The FDA wanted superiority.
But the hemorrhaging was better.
There was less bleeding, but there were more strokes. Dabigatran was approved in the 150 milligram dose. And here you see this line here, this vertical line, shows that the 110 milligram dose, what they call the statistical error or 95% confidence intervals, showed that it wasn't proven to be better than warfarin, but the 150 milligram dose was, because even with the statistical error, you could be sure that it was better in terms of fewer strokes than warfarin. Now, there are different bleeding complications. The most feared bleeding complication that we have as physicians is bleeding into the head. We don't like GI bleeding, believe me. But usually GI bleeding, we know how to manage it with emergency endoscopy and blood transfusion. Bleeding into the head requires emergency brain surgery, and even with that, some patients can be left with a lot of residual neurological disability. We're scared of brain bleeding. And Dabigatran, independent of what dose you use, and another reason that it's a very attractive alternative to warfarin is the bleeding into the brain is 60% lower with Dabigatran, 150 milligrams twice a day, than with warfarin. In fact, all bleeding with warfarin is higher than with Dabigatran. Life-threatening bleeding is higher. Intracranial bleeding, bleeding to the brain, is higher with warfarin. And the combination of major or minor bleeding is higher with warfarin than it is with Dabigatran. I'll get into that. I haven't talked about the disadvantages. I said Dabigatran has advantages. We're doing the advantages side. I'm going to give you both sides of the coin, you know. Okay. Also, there were fewer vascular deaths in the RELY trial among those patients who were randomized to receive Dabigatran compared with warfarin. Now, when you're comparing any one of these new oral anticoagulants to warfarin, you have to ask the question, how good was the warfarin control in the study? If the doctors running the trial do a crummy job with warfarin and they have TTRs in the 40s or 50s, then that they're sort of losers in terms of doing good warfarin control. You know, in our anticoagulation management service, we're in the 60s, mid-60s, high 60s. And this trial, RELY, they were also in the mid-60s. So they did good warfarin control. It tells you they were giving Dabigatran a run for its money. The better the warfarin control, though, the less impressive Dabigatran is for preventing strokes. If you get really superb TTRs in the 70s, greater than 73%, and we don't really have that very often nowadays, but we might in the future if this genetic testing starts to work out and pan out, we might get up there. I know a few private practices in cardiology who have very healthy, reliable patients who are up to the low 70s. It's not that common, but when you get into the 70s for your time within the therapeutic range, stroke prevention is no better or worse, really, with Dabigatran than with Warfarin. But if you have subpar INR and Warfarin dosing, and you get TTRs less than 57%, and that's the bottom quartile in this RELY trial, the stroke rate is much lower with Dabigatran, shown in green, than it is with Warfarin. So I think we should consider Dabigatran for almost all new patients who need stroke prevention for atrial fibrillation. For patients already taking warfarin, I think we should consider switching to Dabigatran if the TTR is less than 73%, or if there is particularly high risk for bleeding into the head. When we do switch patients, and I have switched some of you, it's important to wait till the INR is less than 2.0. And practically, that means omitting warfarin for a day or two before beginning Dabigatran. And we give warfarin for, there may be one or two of you here on dialysis, so Dabigatran is not your drug. And then I think the other point, though, is if you're forgetful, you're in trouble with Dabigatran. Because with warfarin, you have a grace. If you miss a dose of warfarin, it's not the end of the world, because warfarin takes 5 days to wear off. You miss a dose of Dabigatran, you have zero protection. So you have to be really good at taking medication. You have to be good at taking medication twice a day. The other thing is you have to take Dabigatran with food, because it can cause a lot of GI upset if you take it on an empty stomach. It's a twice-a-day drug. A lot of us just have a cup of coffee for breakfast. Coffee is not enough with Dabigatran. You have to change the way you eat breakfast if you're going to take Dabigatran.
Could you define TTR again?
Yeah, TTR is the time that your INR is within therapeutic range. And for atrial fibrillation, it's 2.0 to 3.0. Now, about half of you have DVT or pulmonary embolism or venous thromboembolism, or you're here to support someone with that. The FDA hasn't approved Dabigatran for DVT or pulmonary embolism, but then the manufacturer hasn't applied for permission yet to sell Dabigatran for DVT or pulmonary embolism. But I was the senior author on the pivotal paper dealing with DVT and pulmonary embolism and Dabigatran compared with warfarin. So I want to go over it with you. And I'll tell you right away